Here I am, once again, willing to expose what I have to learn through. Well, I'm 63 in June. Um, what I've learned along the way. Um, there's been a lot of things that I learned first, but other people told me, or things that I saw done, uh, and found out that was wrong. And I'm still learning that way. Both by doing it and by listening to other people and then trying it. I literally try things all the time. I change up how I use a hammer. I change up the hammers. I change up finishing knives so that I don't get carpal tunnel. Since the 90s that I've been doing drywall finishing whenever need be. But most of the guys who said, hey, this is what I use, and that's the only way to use it, that I've learned they end up with carpal tunnel surgeries, and I don't. Maybe it's just because I was born with a better wrist or the connections in my wrist, but I just learned to change the way I put my hand on it, the way I do things, change them up so that maybe there's something that I can learn along the way, and that's what I'm trying to share with you guys. And it's not to say that what I have is better than what you have learned or are better at. You might be. I'm just trying to share with you what I have learned along the way. And if we all did that, then we could all uh, be farther along instead of all, shading each other and saying my way's the only way. As a matter of fact, I just got a comment from a guy after I told him, you know, that what I've been doing is for 25 years and not had a problem. We have 60-mile-an-hour winds. Uh,
We had an example of that 2 days ago.
so he was trying to say that it's junk. Now he's insulting me, and we are a professional mobile home company and wouldn't fly down here in Texas. Well, I've actually done it in Texas and Florida and Missouri, Oklahoma,
Kansas.
Kansas. I've done it in, seems like I did it in Georgia once. But anyway, uh, all of those places have been through high winds, and you know, and there's people that tell me that that, and I'll deal with this guy. He's insulting me, and all I did was tell him, hey, I've been doing it for 25 plus years and never had a problem. And he's saying it's, he's insulting me. So I'm not going to insult him. I'm just going to use common sense, like I do with most of the time that people say what I'm doing is wrong. So if it was wrong, then 40 years later, 30 years later, 25 years later, you would have had some kind of problem. And over again, when I first started, people told me it couldn't be done. So I'm going to put to you guys as humbly as I can. Uh, what I do is what I'm talking to you about is what I've learned, and there's still much more to learn. I have a app on my phone that will teach me how to get my HVAC license and the certifications that I need. Thanks to my son Drew, who took the same app and got his license, and he's now working in Washington, uh, just outside of Seattle, is a town called Bellevue, and he learned. So to get back to, I'm still learning. I work on air conditioners, but and I have two EPA numbers that I work under, and I can buy the Freon. But I really don't know as much as I need to know, and my son now knows probably more than I do about air conditioning. So there's at no point do I think I know it all. And I will say that it there is at no point in your life when you start something that there's not going to be somebody be negative about it, tell you that you can't do it, or that you shouldn't do it, or it's a bad idea, or just why don't you put it off, or I'll help you, but they help. I was going to help you after you get done. What I'm going to say is you're better to have tried and fail than to have never tried at all. Maybe you've heard that. So I suggest that if somebody that's willing to share with you years and years of experience, at least take it into account and try it out. And if it's wrong for you, then it's not. I'm not going to accuse you. You might have a totally different situation. So, what I'm sharing a little bit today, and I'm welcoming all of you guys to interrupt me with any kind of questions, and I'll be happy to share with you what I've learned. So, what I was wanting to talk about today was trim. Probably when probably 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I really started doing a lot more home repairs, 30 years ago, maybe even further back than that. But let's say 30. Most of what you saw then was what you would call a clamshell, a rounded, different size clamshell, sometimes 2.5, sometimes 3. But that's just a smooth, round piece of trim made out of wood. And generally that was kind of hard to get behind. You'd have to take a razor knife or a knife of some kind, cut the edge, try to get behind it, and boy, if you pry on it, it would show. And because it's real smooth, it tended to be unforgiving if you hit it with a hammer. So you would end up having to fill in a larger area. But somewhere along the way, the colonial style became much more common. It's still being sold in Lowe's and Home Depot. That's usually like a 2.5 inch with multiple levels, kind of squared off at the top. A little bit easier to get away from a wall if you have to take it off, and a little more forgiving in some ways. It's not got that real smooth arch. You can hide some, but it is still requires some skill to get around corners, either particularly outside corners. And when I first started out, I didn't have a lot of money, so I used the hand jig to cut 45s, 30s, and 15s, and 32s. 90-degree angles was no problem. Cut it straight across. And then I went to a even better one, which was metal with a bigger saw, and it had a guide on it, so it was just much more professional. And then I went to a chop saw as soon as I could afford one. I really didn't need one at first because I was just replacing pieces here and there that got damaged for whatever reason. And I didn't need a chop saw and a cord to set it all up. I could just do a hand saw or even an hacksaw and cut through it and just keep it straight. And I also had a coping saw. Now, to this day, you can still do coping on trim in the corners. That is a large U-shaped handle on the end of it, and then a small blade on it. It's like two sizes of a pencil lead, and you can take and shape it. A piece of trim, instead of cutting a 45, you can run the square into the corner, and the one that bumps into it, you cut along those edges and shape it with that little coping saw, a hand saw that's been used probably for 100 years, and it still does a good job to this day. And maybe a little on the slow side for outside corners and things like that. But outside corners and inside corners are kind of unforgiving on a saw because sometimes a lot of times they're not true 90-degree angles in those corner, inside or outside. So you end up learning, but you can do a lot when you get used to electric chop saw. You can get very, very used to, getting that angle just a little bit more on the next piece. Um, and then when you lap over going on a long wall, you can 45 and get it really, really close. But, a person can do very, very well doing it by hand. Uh, and then nail sets, which is like pins that you can buy that that drive the size of the nail into the wood, and then you can cover it with a putty or a silicone if you wish, and cover over the nail. You won't even see it. But now, and I used to do hand nail, and so I was also involved with paneling early on. Say, that would be 40 years ago, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. I was doing paneling. That was the thing to do. Uh, you know, and then the trim was darker trim then, and now it tends to be more white and brighter. Back then, you might even do black and rub gold on the edges, because that was a cool thing to do for a while there in the late 70s.
Real fancy.
Yeah, it was like you're gonna make your black furniture. You take an antique piece of furniture and paint it black, and then rub gold on it. And that was just a fad back then. But paneling was everywhere, and it was really, really dark. And the trim was generally a wood stained, and usually not real. Unless you were trying to accent and have a real light wood, then you might do a lighter stain. But most of the time it was a darker stain, and people were impressed by the wood trim. Now we lean more toward a white painted trim. And there are a lot of different profiles now. And one of the things that I like a lot is the PVC trim. And the PVC trim is made totally out of plastic. And what I like about it is it's the same color all the way through. It's easy to clean. You don't have to paint it white. It's white. And it won't rot. So you can put it in bathrooms and never have to worry about it getting wet. If you put it up against a Whirlpool tub or something like that, you can put trim there and it wouldn't cause it to be a problem later on. It doesn't, it doesn't bow. It comes out of the factory straight, stays straight. You don't have to pick through it to get good stuff. It doesn't have any wood grain that's going to show up necessarily. It's really nice stuff. It tends to be a little bit on the hard side to paint if you're going to try to paint it. But particularly outside around the doors is a trim called brick mold around most of the doors that you buy. And they make a replacement PVC for that brick mold. And that trim is, I've used it quite a lot. And usually the door trim is made from a wood called poplar. And it absorbs water. It just has a primer, and most people don't know that. They don't paint it. And so they don't, they have a problem with it in a short time at the bottom. And usually they're finger jointed, and they're little pieces to, make them big pieces. That seems kind of cheap, but it is what it is. So you replace it with a plastic PVC trim, and man, it makes for a very good job. I've never seen it melted. Of course, I haven't put a torch to it, but outside in the heat, even in Texas, I've done it, and all the way down into Austin, Texas, and it gets really hot there. So, and I've seen it on the west side facing, which usually is the hottest. It holds up really, really well. Inside or outside, that PVC trim is expensive, but it holds up really well. There's a lot of different high-end trims, and you can do like the old school which is a true 1x4 or 1x6, and then you put a shoe mold or a quarter round on the bottom and the same on the top. And that gives that the top of that 1x6 or 1x4 a rounded look because you put a quarter round on it, and the quarter round down here gives it that kick plate look, that strong look. It also doesn't have to be quarter round. It can be shoe mold, which is the same as quarter round, except that the top of it sticks out more, and then it rounds down. Now, a lot of times, people will use quarter round and shoe mold around the cabinets. Say when you put in linoleum or something, it's easier to get to. You're going to find the cabinets quite often. You can have a hard time getting a nail gun inside there. There are some nails guns that are exceptions to that. So an alternative to that can be, if you're doing a nail by hand, you don't want to split the wood and you're having a problem with it, you can take that nail and put it in a drill and drill a hole with that nail just as if it's a drill bit. And then when you put a nail in it, it could be the very one you're drilling with, but you can then drive it in real easy through the wood and won't split. It'll go into the material beyond it. So, you know, trim itself, there's a lot of different nails that you can use. For the longest time, I used angle nailers for trim, which is the gun itself is tilted at an angle. And right now I'm using a right angle. One of the things that's difficult about a straight up and down nailer, first of all, the nails are tilted for an angle nailer, and the other one in the straight nailer is straight up and down. It's difficult to get into corners sometimes with a straight nailer, but the battery powered nail trim guns, man, they have come a long ways. But for a long time I used air nailers, and then I went to Senko, which is a battery in it to shoot a spark to ignite propane or butane that drives and makes an explosion and drives it. And they made a framing nailer too. But that Senko did a very good job for a long time. It was expensive. The batteries were expensive. The nails were, on the expensive side. But it was really good, and it lasted until it just, the top of it broke off. Because that's a lot of explosions, and it's got butane and sparks. I have seen times when people ask me, this is going to get kicked a whole lot, can we do something else, and putting his trim on, and can you put a screw there? And I'm like, man, I don't like to do that because it's hard to hide a screw. But if you do, you can countersink it a little bit with a countersink bit, and put a screw there and then go over it with something to try to hide it. But usually what I do is a butterfly. You can either shoot your nails at angles both ways with the trim held tight against the wall, and you'll shoot it both ways into the material, and it won't pull straight out. Now if you shoot straight in, it will pull. It can pull straight off.
We have videos showing that.
Oh, okay. So you would butterfly it, or toenail it so that it would fasten into the other one. But you don't have to shoot at straight angles. And as a matter of fact, it's a good idea not to shoot straight. You can shoot at a little bit of an angle, and that way the trim tends not to come off. So it's a interesting thing. One thing I will say is they make a real fancy trim, or a lot of different profiles, both in wood and in PVC. But guess what? They make a laminated paper trim, and you'll find it in a lot of high-end houses. Really big trim, really like, wow. You think, man, that's a lot of money in wood, but it's not wood. It's laminated paper. And how do I know that? Because if it ever gets wet, it lets you know. So like in bathrooms where the tub might have overflowed, or the shower, people got out of a shower enough times that it got on to the floor and then over to the trim. That trim swells up. You're like, where am I going to find this? Now that paper trim generally is not sold in small quantities. You buy it in large quantities for like a whole house or multiple houses, and then you paint it, and it's hard to tell that it's paper. Uh, but some of those fancy houses are not using that high dollar wood. Then you got crown mold also, and you don't have to use uh, large crown mold, which is quite expensive. One of the guys that I first worked with, his name was Ray Hoffman. He was a really nice guy, really knowledgeable, very opinionated, but a really nice guy. And it was his way or nothing. And I had no problem following because I was taught to always respect my elders and to try to learn anyway. And he really knew what he was doing. So one of the things he would get called out on is, "Hey, could you come out? We need you to work on this crown mold." And crown mold lends itself to somebody who is very detailed conscious. An outside corner on a large 15-inch crown mold with multiple layers or strips of grooves in it, or even raised knots, squares. It requires somebody, and it's at $15 a foot. That's then, I don't know what it is now. You need somebody that gets it right the first time, or very often, the second time. And he was that guy. And you could not get him in a hurry for anything. He had gotten so used to working on just nothing but the most elaborate trim that you couldn't hurry him. A couple times he worked for my dad as an electrician, and he wasn't no faster then, even though he needed to be. He was taking his time, and he was going to do it right. And when I say taking his time, I need to put an exclamation mark on it. He did a fantastic job on trim, and people would go on and on about how great it looked, because those are the people that actually know how hard it is to do an inside corner or an outside corner of crown mold. Particularly, the larger you get, the harder it gets to get it right. And again, those outside corners and inside corners are highly visible, and they are, as I'm going to say again, they are not normally 90-degree angle, or not a true 90 outside corner or inside corner. They're going to be off just a little bit, and boy does it show on a big piece of trim. And he was one of the best that I ever saw, and I'm sure there's good ones out there to this day. But that kind of trim, you need to take your time.
You better know what you're doing.
Yes, and I suggest you allow for mistakes if you haven't been doing it, because you're going to make them. You have to think upside down and backwards when you start working with crown mold. There are some forgiving things that you can do. They make a corner that you can put in there that allows you to cut into it straight, so you don't have to do the inside corners. They also make an outside corner, but I'm not sure they make them for 15-inch or 12-inch. That's for 3 or 4-inch crown mold, maybe 5, and they have a little square box. You can make those. I remember one time there was a mobile home that was having a problem, and they wanted to hang drywall on the ceiling to replace what they took down, which was not drywall. And they put it up there, and they had all this problem with the drywall. Didn't have anything to fasten to. They didn't take and put wood up there on top of the walls to fasten into it. They just hung the drywall. Well, they said, "Hey, what can we do?" So we ended up putting crown mold, a smaller 2.5, 3-inch crown mold, and they said, "Boy, I don't know if we like those inside corners, because can we do something?" I said, "Yeah, we'll make a jig, and we'll make some blocks, and we'll put them in there." So we end up making, I think it was 2x4s cut in half, and let the trim run into it, and that held up the drywall, and they didn't have to finish the outside edges against the wall. Now, if I'd have been in charge of the drywall, I probably would have put wood up on top of the wall, and then you would have been able to fasten to it, and that wouldn't have moved. And but if they still wanted the crown mold, it was just something that we adjusted to, and they asked me to get involved with it. It's like, wow, okay. Well, the mobile home's pretty unforgiving because there's not a whole lot of wood to fasten to. So we did that, and we learned a lot, and I learned a lot. There are all different kinds of profiles for crown mold, just like there are for floor, maybe more, because a lot of it, the bigger you get, the more decorative it gets, and there's some massive amount of choices when it comes to crown mold. Now, we should probably talk about door trim. You have a lot of choices door trim. You can continue to use the same trim, and you would do your doors first, by the way, so that you can run your floor trim into your door. But you don't have to use the same. So you can quite often use a different trim, mostly bigger, around the door, and you can do a fluted trim and put a medallion at each corner at the tops. And there's a lot of choices on that. I think Lowe's Home Depot has at least the circular and the square medallions, and you have the blocks that you can put at the bottom, and you put the fluted in between and over the top of the door. The fluted are like with grooves, maybe 4 grooves down. That fluted trim is really, really nice for like a living room, entry, a cased opening or something like that. You can put it around doors. I've done it a lot in commercial spaces because they want to try to impress you with their entrance, if that makes sense. Other times you can really spend a lot of money using trim that is, and I've actually done door trim with ceramic tile before, but that's not easy. But there's a lot of trim that you have choices for around your door, and it does not have to be the same as the floor trim. So you can go to Pinterest, Instagram, get all kinds of different looks and say, oh wow, I like that. That trim can actually be ceramic tile on the floor too. I've done that several times, particularly in commercial, where you turn the ceramic tile up 4 inches. So that really makes for where you can mop and not worry about getting your trim dirty. Also, there is chair mold, and that is about the area that the top of a chair would hit on the wall, so that in a living room or a dining room, they don't have those scratched up chair marks in theory. Now, not everybody sits in the chair the same height, but it does look good, and it's a way to break up a wall so that you can put wallpaper above it or paint above it and wallpaper below. You can alternate colors. You can paint one below the chair rail a certain color and above the chair rail a certain color. And there's a lot of different profiles you can do. Most of the time it's like a 2.5 inch chair rail that's 1/4 inch 3/8 sticking out at the top, and it swells out to like an inch sometimes on the bottom, and it is usually decorative, and it's made to theoretically to keep the chairs off the wall, but it's made to break up the wall really. And again, the choices on that are amazing. In a commercial, like a restaurant, a lot of times it's almost like a handrail. And they have in hospitals, they have them where you fasten the bottom part with a screw, and then you snap over, or they have in hospitals like a real handrail that they fastened, and that lets
especially ortho.
pushing people down through there. Running into that with I do work for a small clinic, and they have a lot of problems with wheelchair people, particularly people that are infirmed and in battery powered,
Oh
and they
God.
tend to run into the door frames and scratch up the walls and things like that.
Put holes in the walls.
Yeah, and it's you know they're suffering and they're not feeling good, so they have impaired reflexes quite often. And I just got through working for a lady. Her house was scratched up by somebody that was husband to one of the workers, and she, the worker that asked, "Hey, can my husband come over?" Well, she put up with him for long enough, but he was just running into the walls all the time, scratching up the walls. Um, so it's there for a number of different reasons, and there's a lot of different looks. You can have the plastic look. You can have steel handrail. Um, you can get into all different kinds of shapes in a commercial situation and in a residential situation. Um, Quite often, you'll find that your budget, your costs, and the skill level will guide you to what you can afford. If you got all the time in the world and you got it if you don't know it, you can learn it. That's fine. You know, I would say that most of your chair rail is pretty forgiving. Um, it allows you to make mistakes. It's not really uh, as visible unless it's a big room, because most of the time there's furniture against the chair rail. There's chairs that attract your eye. In the dining room, there's the table that everybody looks at. It's pretty forgiving. Now, when you're doing trim and you're staining it, when you're going to fill the holes that the nails make, your tendency is to say, "Hey, I got the stain. I want to get a putty." By the way, they make a putty a lot of different colors because you want to match what that stain does. Well, you look at the color chart and oh, I'll get a putty, they even make it like a crayon, and I'll just, hey, it's this shows it on the chart, I'll just get the crayon and the putty for it. It's not that way. What you need to do is do the stain on your wood, and then take your putty and take a piece of that wood in there and try to match the putty to the color of that wood after it's stained. Um, you need to clean off. And once you push it in there, your thumb moves around, or your finger moves around, and you really want to clean that off because it will tend to show when it dries, particularly. But I used to carry a lot of different colors for the trim colors, and you can uh, buy as many as you want, but you really spend money unnecessarily. So what you would do again, if you're staining, when you go to even pick your stain out, just take a piece of that wood, put the stain on it, see if you like it. Don't wait until you've got it on the wall and then have to tape and mask it. That's a hard way to do it. You can do it that way, but it's a hard way. What you would want, and you may not like it. And I've seen it where people just say, "Oh, I'm taking this off," and they take it back off. So what I suggest is you get the kind of wood that you're going to have, but either on the floor and the chair rail, around the door, or crown mold at the top. Take a piece of that wood and try the stain that you like, and see if if that's really going to look what you want it to when you get through with it. Now, when you do stain, you're going to wipe off. If you spray it on or whatever, you're going to end up having to wipe off the excess. Use a brush, use a roller, wipe off the excess. If you don't, you'll end up with runs, which you may end up anyway. So you need to keep an eye on stain, because it will tend to come off of wood sometimes when you're not even expecting. You turn around, there's stain down in the paint. You need to catch it before it dries. Because that oil, it's in the stain, tends to bleed through paint. So when you go, oh, I'll just paint over it, that doesn't always work out that well. Where to buy trim? Your big places like Home Depot, Lowe's, Menards. I haven't spent a lot of money at Menards, but Menards has a lot of choices, and there are other places. They have quite a few choices, but they don't have it all. So it behooves you to get familiar with other lumberyards, closer people that and the choices they have. And guess what? All of those places, if you ask, can get whatever you want ordered if you find what you like. They can order it for you. So again, you can look online and say, this is what I want, this is what I liked on Instagram or Pinterest or otherwise. I used to use Architectural Digest, but nobody's doing that anymore. So that goes before the internet was really that strong. And the trim doesn't necessarily have to blend in. Quite often it can be a stark difference to break up the colors that you have. Or you can try to get that trim to blend in by painting it the same color. I've seen that before. A lot of times people that you're working for have it in their mind a specific stain, and you might use it. They bought it, but then when you put it up, they don't like it, particularly stain. Paint, it's kind of a nuisance to paint it after it's already been painted and painted again, a different color. But stain is really not, unless you're going darker in the same red or brown or, you know, it's not going to be good because you're going to end up having to replace it most of the time. You can sand all you want to, but you're going to have to get all the way down. That stain goes down into the wood quite a bit. So what would you use to cut a chop? A chop saw is what I usually use now. I have multiple. My favorite chop saw to this day was a smaller one, and it really wasn't very expensive. What I liked about it was I could move it from room to room, and I had a little platform I could put on. I didn't have one that stood up and rolled around. I didn't have a laser on it, although later I did have one that was small like that. I remember it really well, and this boy that I saw today or yesterday, I talked to him today, he dumped paint in my truck onto my favorite chop saw into the part that let it swivel. And
Is that James?
Yeah.
How did I know?
I had that thing where I knew that saw so well, and it wouldn't cut big pieces, but it really did well. Because it was not heavy, it was not hard to get into a house and bang into things, which you don't want to scratch somebody's house. It was comfortable for me, and I got very, very adept with it. So, you don't have to get a big chop saw with a platform with wheels that folds up and that got a laser on it with a sliding compound miter saw with a 12-inch blade. You don't have to do that unless you're wanting to cut a large crown mold. Yeah, you're gonna have to spend some money. You're gonna have to have a big saw, because a small saw won't cut across it. You could do it by hand, but boy, it'd be a labor of love. So there's a lot of different choices in chop saws, and I don't. I really don't have one in particular. I don't really think you need to spend a lot of money on chop saws because there are people who are comfortable with Milwaukee or whatever brand that is, but generally those tools do the same thing. I would say that maybe when you get down to Harbor Freight level, you might actually suffer some quality or longevity, but you're not buying it from Harbor Freight because of quality or how, you're buying it for a budget. And quite often that tool will do a lot of this, almost all the same things. It may have some limitations. So, but a chop saw is one of the things to watch is don't hit a nail, which is not good. And when it gets dull from hitting a nail or a screw or whatever, that chop saw hits something that causes it to become dull, even if it's been chopping wood for a long, long time, cutting wood for that long. If it starts getting dull and splintering the wood, it's time to change the blade. Unless you know how to sharpen that blade, which is probably not something that the average person knows how. But you get those blades are, again, I don't have a particular favorite. I've used the expensive ones, very expensive. I've used the very inexpensive ones, all the ones in between, the Diablo brands and so on. Frood, I could go on and on. But though you don't have to spend a fortune to get a trim job done. Generally, a 10-inch chop saw will do right on up through 5 inches, 5.5 inches would be a 6 inch. You're going to be able to do everything you want to do until you get into very big crown mold. You're going to end up with a much, much bigger saw for that. And you want to be when you're using your chop saw, it has a bed on it that's probably less than 2 feet. So you might want to, so your trim doesn't tend to lift up, or you won't have to hold your hand to hold it down. That means your hand is right next to a saw blade. You want to build up the edges on both sides. So you would build up, you have your bed there, and then you might build up a block on each side so that trim would stay there, and then you can chop it and it doesn't move as much. There's an advantage to knowing your saw, that other than just having the latest saw with the laser. It still requires you having some practice with it. So take some time before you go doing it on. If you don't have practice with that saw, take some time to get to know it. Chop up some pieces, get used to it.
Buy some cheap stuff to chop up.
Yeah, or even if you have a piece that you buy some extra to do that, because you're going to need some extra. Remember, we talked about taking some stain and seeing how it looks. If you like it, you're going to need to buy some extra anyway. And when you're doing crown mold, believe me, you're really going to need some patience, and you're going to have to get used to cutting that way. So a chop saw is a good idea to not. You don't need to spend a bunch of money unless you're getting into a very large crown mold, and the majority of us are not going to be doing that. That's somebody that can afford crown mold. Generally, is not the person that's doing it. So trim on you can see a lot of transition trim around different pieces of flooring. So like if you have a ceramic tile and it goes onto wood floor, generally the wood floor will have a piece of trim to keep that from having a raw edge of that ceramic tile. Now you can get ceramic tile that has a rounded edge on it, but quite often you'll have some kind of a transition wood piece to, if you go from linoleum or VCT or 1x1 tile, or even laminate, particularly laminate has a special trim around it. Each one of those has a specific need. So take your time with those. And they're lining up the holes so that they're not necessarily, 3 holes on one side and a large space on the other side of the door. and usually it's in a doorway or leading from an opening, a cased opening, that you're going to use those kind of that kind of trim. So, when you're doing that trim again, uh, some of that can be aluminum, uh, and it has special nails for that. Uh, that I've smacked my finger many a time with the aluminum trim and the nails that go with it. So I'm well aware of it. And so when you buy that aluminum trim, the nails don't always come in the package. So you need to look inside the package and see if you need to buy the nails. Uh, the wood trim, in its case, quite often you have to countersink if it doesn't have the countersink holes already. Again, you need to make sure that package that's for that door trim at the bottom, look and see if it's got the screws in it. Like I said about the aluminum trim or any kind of transition. When you're buying it, make sure it's got the nails or the screws with it. The laminate floor has specific kinds of trim where you fasten down the steel rail on the bottom with screws. Sometimes you have to get screws that are going into concrete. So those are specific times. You might have to drill through and put in an anchor and then put their screws into it. So that might require you to get an impact drill and an impact drill bit or a hammer drill bit in and the anchors to go in there, and then your screws. And then that trim that sits on top snaps into it. That trim is usually not real wood. It's MDF / particle board trim, and it's really unforgiving. So you don't want to really to make a mistake because it only has a paper or a very slim layer of color. So take your time. The old saying is measure twice, cut once. Okay, that's pretty much the main thing you want to think about when you're cutting trim is to take your time. Make sure you keep your hands clear. Because I've run into several carpenters that did not keep their hands clear and cut their fingers off. Do you notice those guys? It's like, oh man, I know what he did, or I'm pretty sure I know what he did. One of my favorite guys, Jerry, he didn't do it with a chop saw, but he did it with a table saw, and so he's got a funny story about that. But and I'll tell you that story. As a matter of fact. He cut his fingers. He went to the hospital, little local hospital. So he kept his finger in ice, and he got to the local hospital. And the little lady said, "Let me see." So he unwraps it. I was like, "Oh, honey, I don't know if I can look at that too bad. We can't do anything for you here. You're going to need some surgery. So we're going to put you on a ambulance." He says, "I don't need an ambulance. I just get somebody up here and they'll take me to the." He said, "No, you got to ride in the ambulance. We ain't going to have you passing out going down the road." Well, what Jerry was probably thinking was, I need to smoke my cigarette. So they got in, they put him in the ambulance and they, put a sheet over him and all that. He's got his hand up there and that the ambulance goes, "Hey, do you mind if we stop and get something to eat? Because, it's not like a big emergency." He's like, "Wow, that's kind of callous, but, yeah, I don't mind, but as long as I can smoke." He said, "Well, we can't, you can't be out of the gurney. You have to stay in the gurney. That's insurance."
Then you can't eat.
He said, "No, you can't eat then. If I can't, I want out of the, I want to smoke a cigarette. And you ain't going to let me smoke around all this oxygen." So they pushed him out in the gurney so they could eat. They pushed him out into the parking lot. Now I'm visualizing this guy's laying in a gurney smoking cigarettes in the parking lot while they're eating. Everybody in the restaurant's eating, looking at him smoking a cigarette, laying on his back. But that guy is an amazing, skilled guy, despite lacking digit or parts of a digit.
Just as cool as he can be, too.
Yeah, he's a sharp, smart guy. I really like Jerry Crenshaw. Jerry's a good guy. And I've seen him cut stuff to the 32nd of an inch, and I didn't need him to. I was like, wow, that's tight. You know, and he was like, I don't know how to do any other. I don't have both all my fingers, so I got to make it fit with one hand. He had both hands, but you know, he was just saying. So I recommend that you take care and take time, and I hope I'm sharing with you something that you can use. And I wish you all the best. And I'll see you another time. Maybe next Saturday we'll talk about something else. Save up your questions. See you later. Do we have sound?
Yes, we had some.